Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, we will now commence with the third and final session of today's conference, which will address the issues and opportunities and challenges towards greater regional energy security. I now hand over the proceedings to Ambassador Sibal for the final session.
Well, we're coming to the end of this seminar, and there are some enthusiastic people who have stayed on till the very end. Towards greater regional energy security. It's a interesting subject because we are ourselves very concerned about our own energy security, being an energy deficient country. And if you look at the statistics, we'll be relying more and more on imports of energy as the years go and our economy grows. But this panel is not there to discuss India's energy security, but the regional energy security, which means dealing with the whole issue of energy security, which affects everyone in a cooperative manner within a regional framework. And then the next question is, what is it that can be done within such a framework? India being the largest economy and at the center of this region, would then have to assume the responsibility for ensuring energy security in the broader region. This morning, we heard from Minister the projects India is doing with regard to easier, more efficient way of energy supplies to some of our neighboring countries. And he mentioned Bangladesh and Bhutan and Nepal, that the pipelines that we are building. Now, in terms of provision of energy, and he mentioned that 100% of this energy that Nepal needs, oil and gas, that oil that Nepal needs is being provided by India and Bhutan also. But it is just that India is importing energy and facilitating the flow of this energy to some of our neighboring countries. It's not as if India has domestic resources which then can be utilized to give long-term confidence to some of our neighboring countries that India will look after their energy security. Now, in the case of Nepal, they are hobnobbing with China to get some oil supplies from them in order to have some margin of maneuver against India, keeping what happened some time ago with regard to blockage of trucks carrying oil to Nepal. In the case of Bangladesh could play a role in India's energy security also, apart from the fact that they have resources themselves, gas resources, which so far, for political reasons, they were not willing to share with us, but we'll see how this whole thing proceeds. But more than that, in terms of energy flows from the east through Bangladesh, from Myanmar through Bangladesh to India, etc., etc. He also mentioned Trincomalee in Sri Lanka and what the Indian Oil Corporation affiliate is doing there. With Pakistan, it is a whole issue of security per se. So I don't think we have any responsibility towards Pakistan for within the framework of regional energy security. But there have been all these projects like the IPI and the Tapi pipeline that Well, now the IPI, I think, is effectively, from India's point of view, dead. We are keeping the ball floating for political reasons and not foreclosing forever possibility of availability of energy from Turkmenistan, because Turkmenistan naturally is very committed to this project, and some other countries like the United States have been uh, backing this. But given our relations with Pakistan, and I don't see any improvement in these relations in the foreseeable future, I don't think TAPI will fly. With regard to Afghanistan, that's an energy deficient country. I don't know whether we can take any step which would help them in terms of energy supply, but they got Iran next door, so they can easily get their uh, energy from Iran, depending on the evolution of the political situation. Finally, there is this uh, question of regional energy security in the larger context of international discussions on the subject, because whenever you meet within the SCO framework or the BRICS framework or any other framework, energy security is a prominent subject for discussion and exchange of views. More so currently in view of the manner in which the United States is wanting to throttle Iran in every possible way, which will have serious repercussions for India's energy security. Because if they compel us, and he will tell us whether they will succeed or not, to reduce our offtake of oil from Iran to zero by November, this would have very serious repercussions long term on our relationship with Iran. And there are other dimensions to this relationship which remain very important for us. So we have a huge task, diplomatic task ahead of us, of how we balance our interests with the US and their tendency now to bully the rest of the world through sanctions and using the dollar as a weapon, and our longer term interests in Iran. And there is also beyond this whole question about the differential, the price differential between the East and the West that the oil producing more to actually remove this discrimination. I've heard the minister make strong statements in this regard, and also cautioning them that if you keep increasing your prices and making the whole and the impact of that would be to make the economies of so many of the countries, including India, unviable. You might suffer in the long run, because then we may have to go in for alternative sources in much quicker than we might have done otherwise. So there are all these issues involved in the whole issue of regional uh, energy security. Now we have some very competent people who are going to speak to us on this subject, who have got their teeth into it professionally. And we have four panelists. Ambassador D.P. Srivastava, who was our ambassador to Iran, and he's a senior fellow and cluster head. And you are replacing whom? Are you replacing anybody? Okay. Then we have Mr. Sunjav Sudhir, who will be substituting for. Well, I think he doesn't need to substitute. He's very welcome in his own capacity, because he is key to our energy policy in the ministry. And in any case, Mr. Ratul Puri won't be there, Chairman of Hindustan Power Projects, but Mr. Sanjay Sudhir would be there. And there is Mr. Harish Saran, Executive Director, Marketing, PTC India Limited, and Ms. Shebonti Roy Dadwal, Senior Fellow, IDSA. So over to you, Ambassador Srivastava. Now I'm told that you have what, 10 minutes or what?
Thank you, sir. I'll focus on the electricity, because we have Sanjay from petroleum, and he is the best qualified to take care of oil and gas. And here are two immediate neighbors, Nepal and Bhutan. They are important, and we have to look at them in terms of their long-term development requirements and our own energy needs against against the background of progressively more stringent emission norms following Paris Convention. We have a target of stepping up our renewable energy production to 165 gigawatt by 2022, and we have given a voluntary commitment to have 40% of our total energy mix consisting of non-fossil fuel by 2030. Now, renewables are intermittent source of energy. So if you have 100 megawatt of renewable, which is a wind or solar working at say 18% or 20% capacity, you need to put up equal amount of balancing power to take care of the time when the wind or solar is not available. For instance, at night or whenever the wind is not blowing. So that creates a problem. You have the option of thermal. If you back it down during the time when the wind is available, you will be running the thermal power plant at suboptimal level and incurring costs. Uh, Nuclear cannot be backed down, and there is a limit to how much you can increase mm, the generation. We have a very peculiar problem that because we are not able to match the variable nature of demand, which peaks during morning and evening hour, or it peaks in summer, goes down in winter. So instead of putting up matching variable capacity, what happens is that the base load is back down, which is a much more costly proposition. That is, you build up excessive base load and then decide to utilize only part of it. Now, why I'm giving this background is that Nepal and Bhutan, which are producers of hydroelectricity, perfectly fit in with our requirement. They produce hydroelectricity. They have a huge potential. Nepal has about 83,000 megawatt, uh, out of which about 43,000 megawatt can be realistically exploited. In case of Bhutan, it is about 23,000 megawatt. They are actually using only about 1,600 megawatt, which is mostly financed by India. So you have a huge scope for ramping up hydro power production in these countries, which will bring them very handsome economic gains. In fact, it can transform completely Nepal's economy, and it will solve our dilemma, that is how to supplement intermittent renewables with alternate source of energy to provide balancing power. Now, in case of Nepal, despite this enormous hydroelectric potential, they are actually net importer of electricity, and that comes from India. Uh, there's something to do with the policies they have chosen, and this my submission would be, at the end of the day, it's not just we have to look at what India could or should do, but it also requires some major political decisions on the part of our neighbors, because in the same context, Bhutan has gone ahead and they are now the richest economy in the SAARC region. Nepal could also have followed that path, and there is, of course, a viewpoint that the king did not want to go down that path because, one, he feared that this might increase India's salience in Nepalese politics, and the second was that this would change the nature of the polity, and which actually has happened for the worse in that country. So it requires some major decisions, but if Nepal is willing to come forward, there's a perfect convergence of interest in their unutilized hydro potential, and our need to have more electricity, especially clean energy, in the context of Paris Convention. There is already a grid available, but this will have to be seriously upgraded. It is only about 80 megawatts so far. Uh, One positive step which Nepal has taken is that the Nepalese parliament has endorsed the SAARC Framework Agreement for Energy Cooperation in August 2016, but it still has to be uh, implemented. Uh, then we have Bhutan, and of course, Bhutan presents a very positive picture. They have 30,000 megawatt of hydropower potential, of which 23,000 megawatt can be is economically feasible. So far, only 1,600 megawatt is actually installed, and which accounts for 27% of government revenue and 14% of Bhutan's GDP, and it has also made Bhutan's per capita income highest in the SAARC region. Now, the way forward, if Bhutan has to wants to increase the power production, the market is in India, and we have to have a consistent policy. Some time back, the government decided to have to let in the instead of simply government to government agreements, let the private sector come in. And Tata set up a plant, but then some restriction was put that the electricity should be sold to the grid, government grid. Now, this kind of policy change does inhibit the private sector. Uh, if you have to go ahead and allow Bhutan to ramp up its production, we have to find a market, which is difficult at the moment in India because there is a slump in demand. I believe that this is only a temporary phase, uh, the, which we may get over in 5 6 years uh, time, because India has one of the lowest power consumption in the world. We are, of course, much higher than Nepal or or Bangladesh, but still we are much below the world average. So there's a huge scope for increasing power consumption and absorbing the Bhutanese power. But the other way to look at it is that this could be Bhutanese power could be sold to Bangladesh, which has a deficit. Which brings me to Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, here they have the power tariff in Bangladesh is about 8 to 9 US cents per unit, which is roughly three times the tariff for renewables in India, which are now around 2.6 rupees, and more than double the tariff of thermal power, coal based power in India. So there is a huge demand, and we have the price advantage, so we can supply. Uh, there is a small beginning made OTPC. This is ONGC Tripura Power Corporation. They have a 726 megawatt gas-fired power plant, which is supplying about 120 megawatt to Bangladesh. And Adani Group is setting up a 800 megawatt thermal power plant, which is going to be for which is dedicated for supply to Bangladesh. This can be taken forward, but we have only a limited window. And here, Nisa, I'll just I, that where's Kishan? There was a slide which I wanted to show. We have a limited window because so far we are talking of a regional or sub-regional market, but we have competition, and the competition comes from China, and they are already active in Nepal, and they're spread. But their handicap is that what they have deep pockets, they can invest, but that electricity, the market is in India, and unless India agrees. Now, there are two opinions that we can use Chinese money to close our power deficit. The other view is that, once they come in a strategic area, this will have long-term implications for us. But with or without coming into Nepal, they have now other options. And this is what I am trying to point out. China has made very heavy investment in perfecting ultra high volt cable technology. Now, this technology is also with Germans and with Switzerland, but they have not applied it on the scale which China is trying to do or is already doing. And there are some figures here which are very startling figures. They have, by between 2013 and 2018, in 5 years period, Chinese overseas power transactions have reached $450 billion. Now, these are announcements. How much has matured, we do not know, but maybe a firmer figure is around $100 billion, certainly. And the advantage of ultra high voltage transmission line is that it minimizes the transmission cost and it minimizes the transmission loss. So theoretically, it is possible to transmit the power from Central Africa to Europe and at a fraction of the cost of European tariff. Now, I'll just quote. Uh, this is a statement by Stephen Chu, a former U.S. Secretary of Energy. He has called China's rise in UHV technology as a Sputnik movement for the US, alluding to the Soviet Union's 57 launch of the first Earth orbiting space satellite. And again, I quote him: the biggest boon for China's global grid ambitions is UHV cable technology, while other companies such as Germany, Siemens, and Swedish Swiss conglomerate ABB also have the technology. Chinese companies have been the first to deploy it on a grand scale, developing global industry standards. Now, if they can, and they are already buying fairly substantial shares, 30% in Portuguese power grid company, a government utility company. They have invested some huge amount in Brazil. Uh, Nepal sits next door, and the market is much, or the investment required is much smaller. So we need to move forward on tying up the hydropower which is available on our footsteps and which we need to balance our energy portfolio. Now, the last point is that there is a suggestion to have integrated energy market. I'm not sure of that. That is something which takes, which is no, it's a process which is still not complete in EU, despite the fact that EU has been in existence much longer. But we can at least have grid connectivity, and we can uh, make sure that whatever surplus potential they have comes to India, and it'll enrich them, and it will also meet our energy requirement. Thank you. This map, I forgot. This. Maybe you can have a look at the spread of the Chinese investment in the power grid. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Now over to you, Sanjay. What are you going to speak on?
I'll focus on oil and gas.
Oil and gas. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So first of all, let me thank Mr. Arvind Gupta for inviting me here. And I must also share with you how honored I am to be on a panel which is chaired by Ambassador Sibal. A little over 2 decades ago, he was my first ambassador in Cairo, and that was how my diplomatic career began. Sir, as you mentioned right in the beginning, that India is itself very heavily reliant on imports. So as far as oil and gas is concerned, for oil we import about 83% of our consumption. As far as gas is concerned, things are a little better. So we import about 47% of our consumption. But still, we feel that there is something which we can share with our neighbors. And that is our own developmental experience, the expertise which we have built in the last several decades, and also the infrastructure which we have created for ourselves. And we feel that an incremental addition to this infrastructure takes across energy to our neighbors and also builds new bridges. So this interconnectivity thing gets supported. In addition to all this, uh, it also supports the initiatives taken by the government, for instance, the Neighborhood First policy and the Act East policy, which has already been spoken about by Mr. Arvind Gupta in his inaugural remarks and also by our Minister for Petroleum Natural Gas earlier this morning. What I will do is that I'll just run you through the several initiatives which we have taken with our neighbors, and just to give you a sense on what all we have done in the last 2-3 years by this incremental extension of infrastructure and just innovatively working with our neighbors to create more value in this oil and gas sector, which has then resulted in promoting their energy security also along with our own. I'll start with Bangladesh. So, with Bangladesh, one of the things which we are doing is to build a pipeline from Siliguri to Parbatipur. So, for Bangladesh to transport high-speed diesel all the way from Chittagong to Parbatipur up in the north is not only more expensive, but it's also very cumbersome and uncertain because of weather challenges, infrastructure challenges, and all. So, what we are trying to do is to build a pipeline, a 130-kilometer pipeline between Siliguri terminal of Numaligarh Refineries Limited and Parbatipur. So, the work has already started. EIL is doing this implementation. But till the time this pipeline actually comes up, we've already started supplying them high-speed diesel through railway. So we are sending them about 5 rail rakes every year. And in about 2.5 years' time, the pipeline will be in place. And once you have the pipeline, it does not only have the cost advantage, but also the reliability advantages there. We are also expanding their refinery, refurbishing and expanding their East Coast refinery near Chittagong. Gas, as Ambassador Sibal mentioned, Bangladesh is a country which, in this part of the world, actually knows what gas is all about, and it has benefited from its own reserves, huge reserves of gas. But today they've come to a situation in which their own consumption far outstrips their production, declining fields and declining production. So they have no choice but to resort to LNG. And one of our companies has already contracted LNG in the private sector. One of our other companies, Petronet LNG, is currently in discussions with Bangladesh to set up a big plant, a big 6.5 million metric tons of LNG in Kutubdi Island. So once this is there, it will take care of a large chunk of their gas requirements. From the other side of Bangladesh, from the western side of Bangladesh, what we are doing is that the pipeline infrastructure which we are creating, and I'm sure Minister would have mentioned this, Urja Ganga, which is basically to connect our 8 northeastern states and 5 eastern states. We are planning to extend it a little beyond Dhamra, a point called Panitar, up to a power plant at Khulna, which is a gas-based power plant. This would be a pipeline of about 60 kilometers length. So we're discussing with them, and I think work is in progress, good progress. We are already there in the upstream sector, but that has been going on for quite some time. No, as we are helping Bangladesh in their energy security, they are also helping us, and I must acknowledge that. For us to take LPG across to Tripura is a very problematic thing because our road infrastructure, so particularly during the monsoon seasons, it crumbles. And then we have no resort but to request Bangladesh to allow our trucks to go through Bangladesh territory and transport LPG. So what we are trying to work on now is to connect Chittagong, where there are already existing LPG terminals by Total and Bangladeshi companies, to Tripura, so that we are able to transport LPG from Chittagong to Tripura. And then finally, and eventually in make some more investments and add to their LPG infrastructure, thereby not only supplying LPG to Bangladesh but also to Tripura. Now coming to Sri Lanka, Ambassador Sibal mentioned about Trincomalee and the role played by Lanka Indian Oil Corporation in actually modernizing the retail sector. Lanka IOC has about one third of the retail sector. But in addition to owning one third of the retail sector, it's actually modernized it quite a bit. It owns the one third of the service company also, pipelines and other things. So it has taken that sector to a different level. I mean, so what has happened as a result is their own companies like Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, they have a different benchmark to follow, and it's helping the retail sector as such. The new thing which we are doing, I mean, this Lanka IOC thing has been going on since about 2003. But the new thing which we have done in the last 1 year is that we have been able to start work on setting up an LNG terminal in Sri Lanka also. Now, unlike other countries in this region, particularly India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka does not have any gas. So all their power plants are liquid fuel based power plants, particularly in the region around Colombo. Actually, that radius of about 60 kilometers has about 60 to 70% of the population of Sri Lanka. And Sri Lankans, as you know, are very environmentally conscious people. So what we have been discussing with them is that a good shift from liquid fuels would be natural gas, and for that we can work with them and build an LNG terminal. And this is something which we are working on a slightly different model. We are partnering with a Japanese company, so we have a share of about 47.5%. A Japanese company has a share of about 37.5, and Sri Lankan about 15%. So together as a JV, we are putting up a LNG terminal which will feed all the power plants which are there, including the one which is in the pipeline, which is between NTPC and Ceylon Electricity Board. So once we have an LNG terminal there, it not only takes care of power generation, moving to a much cleaner as well as a cheaper fuel. Our next stage would be to actually move into CNG for transportation, Colombo being the hub, population concentration. CNG for transportation sector, and also CNG for piped natural gas. Now, these are things which I'm sure Minister would have shared the initiatives which we have been taking here in expanding our network of city gas distribution. So we thought we must share that, and we are progressing on that quite well. Nepal, we have been supplying 100% of the supplies since mid 70s. But what is new in the last 2-3 years is that being aware that all these border crossings and all the transportation of petroleum products by trucks has its own difficulties, especially when there are some kind of political unrest in Nepal. So the supplies get disrupted, people are inconvenienced. Not only that, these things also give rise to bilateral issues. So we are building a pipeline from Motihari to Amlekhganj, about 70 kilometers. In April, when Prime Minister Oli visited India, the two prime ministers actually witnessed the groundbreaking ceremony for this pipeline. And Nepalese are so keen that they've already made a request to extend this pipeline beyond Amlekhganj to Chitwan. Not only the product pipeline, so this will carry petrol and diesel. They've also requested for a pipeline for LPG along the same alignment. So we have prepared a DFR for LPG pipeline from Motihari to Amlekhganj, as well as a natural gas pipeline from Gorakhpur to Sunwal. So in say about 3-4 years from now, this pipeline, the Motihari Amlekhganj pipeline, will take about 30 months. So 30 months we'll start supplying them through pipelines, petrol as well as diesel. But 3-4 years down the line, we should also be having natural gas pipelines and LPG pipelines. Myanmar also, we made a beginning, taking advantage of the political transition there. We also realized that the oil and gas infrastructure in Myanmar is quite creaky. So what we are doing is that across the More-Tamu border, again, we're trying to extend the infrastructure which we have in our northeast across to Myanmar. So across the More-Tamu border, we've already started supplying high-speed diesel through trucks. with the idea that initially we'll start building some storage capacity on the Myanmar side, and then gradually make a pipeline to connect the northeast, the northern parts of Myanmar. We are also working on expanding the refinery, which is very close to Yangon, and building an LNG terminal. Because again, Myanmar has also been always very rich and considered very rich in gas. But their problem is that they have already contracted 80% of their gas, most of which is going to China. Some part is going to Thailand. So they have now reached a pass in which they do not have gas for their own requirements. So in order to help them out in that, our companies are working with them to build these LNG terminals. Bhutan and Mauritius also, we are supplying 100% of their products. But the association actually goes beyond just supplying 100% of the product. The association is more about 100% reliability also. So it has, whatever supply we undertake has to be reliable. And this we do not only for the countries where we are making 100% supply. We do it also for Sri Lanka. So whenever there's a crisis or fuel crisis or anything, immediately we rush some supplies from Paradeep refinery or from Kochi refinery or some other refinery where we can spare that capacity. In addition to this, of course, the usual things about capacity building, training courses, etc., we are already doing. So I thought I'll share these thoughts.
Yeah. No, that was very useful indeed. Now, may I request Mr. Harish Saran, Executive Director, Marketing, BTC India Limited. You will be speaking on what?
Power only.
Power,
Yeah.
okay.
Good evening and thank you, sir. Most of the things related to power have already been discussed by Ambassador Srivastava. But I will give few of the insights about the reason as well as what are the infrastructures which are available at present for inter-regional power trading between the countries of the South Asian region, as well as what are the new infrastructures which are being proposed to enhance the power trading between the countries. Ultimately, power is main power. If we discuss about the energy, power comes foremost, because if the people don't have power, then that leads to a lot of problems in the country, in the region. When we see this region has almost 22% of the world population. And when we discuss about the mass of land, that is only 4% of the world land is available with the region. So the nature was very, generous in giving the population, but at the same time, they were miser in giving the land to us. 71% of the population in this South Asian region is only having access to the electricity. So again, almost 30% of the people, they don't have access to the electricity in the region. Though we have all the resources which are required for generation of power, we do have coal, we do have water, we do have solar also, because this is the only region in the world where you can see sunlight almost more than 300 days in a year. As far as power cooperation is concerned, lot of things are taking place between India, Bangladesh, India, Bhutan, India, Nepal, India, Myanmar. When we discuss about Bangladesh, Bangladesh is a densely located country. They do have coal, they do have gas, but it is economical for them to import power from India. Right now, about 500 megawatt power is being imported by Bangladesh, though there is a demand of almost 6,000 to 7,000 megawatt of power in Bangladesh, because they get cheaper power from India instead of burning their gases and exploring their coal mines. Bangladesh and India, they have moved a lot in the field of power cooperation in the last 3 years. There is a line which carries 500 megawatt, and this line is getting upgraded to 1000 megawatt in the next 2 to 3 months. Again, Tripura, as Ambassador Srivastava has said, there is already a flow of power from Tripura, ONGC project in Tripura, to Bangladesh. And again, there are talks between the neighboring states of India with Bangladesh to develop transmission lines at low voltage levels. When we discuss about India and Nepal, right now Nepal is taking a lot of power, almost 350 megawatt from India. And Nepal is also connected with Bihar, Uttarakhand, and Uttar Pradesh. And these power exchanges are taking place for a very long time. But now, seeing the uh, this commercial advantage in trading of power, there is already a line which is charged at 220 kV level, and right now it is supplying almost 400 to 500 megawatt power to Nepal. Again, government of India and government of Nepal are discussing the possibility of having another one extra high voltage interconnection between the two countries, because ultimately when Nepal new hydropower projects would get commissioned, finally the power will be purchased by India only. So ultimately the purchaser will be India. When we discuss about India and Bhutan, Bhutan is already generating 1500 megawatt of power, hydropower, and almost 95% of power is sold to India only. And that is a very good source of revenue for Bhutan. Their GDP is totally dependent upon this power sale. Recently, India started supplying power to Myanmar also, though it is a very less quantum, about 500 megawatt, and it is a very small city or a small area in Myanmar which is connected to Manipur, and Manipur is supplying that power. But talks are already on to upgrade the existing infrastructure which is there between Manipur and Myanmar. Though talks are going on between India and Sri Lanka for a very long time to develop under the sea cable, high voltage direct current under the sea cable, but nothing has materialized so far. Though there is a scope of power which is required by Sri Lanka, because they don't want to, I mean, they are very environmentally concerned country, and because of their geographical location, it would be, I mean, wiser decision for them to have a under the sea link with India instead of investing in having new power projects in their own country. So, sir, these are the few transactions which are going on, and government of India has already formulated a cross-border energy trade guidelines, which are very shortly due to be published. And in those guidelines, lot of things have been emphasized upon to invest to attract investment in the region. So ultimately, this policy has been drafted keeping in view the interest of the entire South Asian region. And during the initial phases, we have received good responses from the neighboring countries, and we are moving towards a South Asian power market, where one day power from Bhutan will be sold to Bangladesh, power from Nepal could be sold to Bangladesh, and power from Sri Lanka could be sold to Bangladesh. These things are going to happen. It is only a matter of time. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very informative. And now the last speaker is, one never knows how to pronounce MS. No, Shebonti is fine, but MS, what do you say? Mrs. Miss. Okay, Shebonti, Reda, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Dr. Gupta, for asking me to speak. This session was supposed to be we were supposed to be discussing South Asian regional energy cooperation. From what I have heard so far, it seems to be a lot of bilateral deals are going between India and the respective neighbors. So I'm so glad that Mr. Saran, you finished what you did and said in the future we will have a truly integrated South Asian market. That's what we're heading for. And this is really not the first time that we've looked at regional projects. We talked about, for decades, we've been talking about gas pipelines, which the chair also mentioned, and none of them have come to fruition for mainly because of security reasons, but there were also other factors that were involved. But power trading, of course, has taken off. So I will also focus more on power trading, though actually trading, energy trading in general. And as Dr. Gupta earlier told me, I always look at problems. So I will be looking at the challenges and the problems, that why it is hasn't taken off. The potential is huge, as you mentioned, as every one of the speakers mentions, huge, but it really hasn't fulfilled that potential. We haven't, and we're a long way from it. So I would really like to, being the last speaker of the last session, I'm sure I would like to keep it short before everybody disappears from the room. So there are three things really which are required for power trading. And these are, of course, generation, there's investment for the power projects, and the distribution infrastructure for the evacuation of the power. Now, the problem is that different countries have different rules and regulations. And this has really been the problem, that is, we've never been able to resolve these issues amicably amongst our neighbors. And this has always come in the way for a true integration, even if there was a will. Which brings me to my next and most important point, is lack of political will. I mean, India's image, of course, as a big brother, the perception that we have this really overbearing attitude towards our neighbors has always been a deterrent. I think for our neighbors doing business with us, they were not comfortable about being dependent on us. Of course, the fact that there are sub-regional power grids now that are successfully running, and we've had bilateral deals with a lot of our neighbors and very successfully, may have assuaged a lot of the doubts that they had. But for a truly, like, there will be true integration only when there, like you said, Nepal and Bangladesh, Bhutan and Bangladesh, all of them, they can actually also trade with each other and not just have to go by India be the focal point and each one of them dealing with the other. Okay, what are the other problems? First and foremost, unless any project, whether it's pipelines, whether it's grids, etc., unless they're economically viable, they're not going to really succeed. So economic viability is, of course, a very, very important factor. And but the problem is that the regulatory mechanisms are just not there in place in most of our neighbors. India, in fact, is the only country, I think, which has a regulatory mechanism. And the others are still working at it, but it's still to be functional completely. This, again, creates problems about pricing. And in fact, this morning I was reading in the papers, in one of the Nepali papers, in fact, that Nepal is now thinking, you said we importing about 350 to 400 megawatts in Nepal is importing from India. We're also importing a little bit from Nepal. But now Nepal is talking about actually that because monsoons have been good, that they might reduce their imports from India. So these are all the issues that are going to be having to, be resolved before, some kind of an understanding and true cooperation really builds up. There is, of course, a conflict of interests between the supplier and the importer. Always, the supplier will always want to sell maximum price, and the importer will always, of course, minimum price. So that has to be resolved. There is, of course, also because the lack of regulatory mechanisms, there is a lack of clarity also in the tax regimes of the various countries. And so the harmonization, also the coordination of power pricing, etc., also has to be is a deterrent, has been a problem, has been a challenge. Financing. Someone also mentioned the fact that finances have to be, and because of the lack of regulatory mechanisms, you will have investors hesitating to really, want to commit to a project. So this is also a major factor. And finally, as I said right in the beginning, political will. It's all these countries are democracies, really, except Bhutan, also in a way. So you have this attitude that, for instance, let's look at Nepal. When the Nepali Congress was in power, it was the Maoists who opposed the power project with India. And now you have the Maoists who are now in power, and they realize the same happened with Bangladesh and the gas pipeline. Whether it was BNP or whether it was Army League, whoever was in power, the opposition would stop it. So they all realize that when they are in power, this is a lucrative, a very, very cooperative, a successful thing, and it will be very beneficial to that country. But they just, for political reasons, they don't let it happen. And finally, I think the biggest factor is also this lack of a conflict resolution mechanism, I think is just not there. And I think this is extremely important. I've often wondered why, whether it's again pipelines or electricity grids, the lack of a conflict resolution mechanism, which is internationally accepted, which can then, if there is a dispute between the trading nations, then this can go. I mean, there is, of course, a blueprint of it, the Energy Charter. I've always talked about it. I've never got an answer from the government, actually, why we never really, maybe you can tell us why we've never really, we started negotiations on I think we're also an observer for the International Energy Charter, the new International Energy Charter. But we've never really got an answer about why we haven't really come on board. Maybe one of the other panelists can tell me why. What are the reasons why? What are the problems that we couldn't? Because this would resolve it. It covers the entire gamut of energy trading, pipelines and electricity grids, etc. So as I promised, I will keep it very, very short. But the encouraging thing is that a sub-regional uh, energy cooperating trading has developed, and it's moving smoothly. With Bangladesh, as we said, about 500 megawatts. They are planning to take it up to about 9,000 megawatts by 2041. So that's the kind of cooperation we're looking at. And of course, negotiations are also right now being discussed, are taking place between Bhutan and Nepal and Bangladesh about trading amongst themselves. Before I end, I would like to say one thing is that, yes, India is being very, very cooperative, being very helpful. But when you have, recently in 2016, in fact, when we came out with the guidelines for power trading, our neighborhood, especially Bhutan and Nepal, really opposed it like anything, because it was, again, of course, there were later on clarifications about that 51% ownership for Indian companies, etc. So these are the things, I think, that when we really want to expand our cooperation in the region, we really need to look at these issues and discuss it with our neighbors before, instead of having to be subjected to the storm of protest, and this kind of, again, strengthens their belief that India is just trying to be overbearing and, just trying to take over. And, so I just would like to end on that note. And then I think we should just be a little more sensitive to our neighbors' concerns. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I had taken out my watch to make sure that you stuck to 10 minutes and all. I didn't need to do that at all because you've been so good and you've made your presentations very concise. And we have about 15 minutes left, but I just take a couple of minutes, couple of remarks I'd like to make before we invite questions from the floor. One is that it's been very useful in terms of what India is doing with regard to cooperation with our neighboring countries in the energy sector. Many of these things are not really they are in the public domain, but they have not succeeded in changing the perception that India is difficult with its neighbors and India is not cooperative, India is too self-centered, etc., etc. Actually, I would not agree with the last speaker about India's lack of political will. I think there have been deficiencies on the part of India, shortcomings in our policies, but it is more because our neighboring countries have lacked the political will to cooperate with India. I served in Nepal and I have had negotiations with the Nepalese as far back as the early 80s, and very little has been achieved because the Nepalese really didn't want to. Ways to stall the progress in negotiations. And in this, initially, the World Bank played a very unhelpful role. And they had a Canadian who was working for them in Nepal. and he was very difficult. And the Nepalese Ministry of Water Resources was being guided by him. And then the World Bank was looking at regional projects that Bangladesh should have a say between what India and Nepal do together with regard to water projects, and that Bangladeshis, the rights of Bangladesh as the lower riparian must be taken into account. Therefore, injecting another complication into our already very difficult bilateral negotiations. Similarly, we've had problems with Sri Lanka and others. See, when it comes to a question of political will, it's not simply a question of taking the issue of power. It's the overall relationship what these countries want. And then specific areas of cooperation get fitted into that framework. But we've always had other neighbors for various reasons trying to keep India away as much as possible, not giving India what they perceive would be a hold on their domestic politics, and of course playing the China card against us. With regard to Nepal's water resources, what have been mentioned just now, the 43,000 or whatever is actually utilizable capacity. In fact, I used to tell the Nepalese, you wouldn't have had the problems you've had on the ground with regard to Maoism and poverty and revolts and this and in that, because you never developed your country. And here was a resource which you could have used to develop your country. And it was a win-win both for India and Nepal. But I will not go into details why they were not interested. Now, of course, China is very much present in Nepal. I've heard stories that the Nepalese have really bought over, the Chinese have really bought over a lot of people in the government, and they've been creating a lot of complications for companies, private sector companies, to operate in Nepal, although a couple of projects are taking off. But I think we'll be very wise to make sure that to prevent China from investing in a big way in Nepal, in their water resources, by making sure that India will import power only from companies in which the Indians have a majority stake. Anyway, that's a policy decision government has to take. Some questions have been left unanswered. Maybe when we have another round of discussions about the gaps that need to be strengthened in the localized national bilateral grids, and what needs to be done to ensure midterm and long-term energy security, and which authority agencies would address these questions. But even if they have not been answered, I think there's been a lot of information that we've obtained about what is practically being done on the ground, and it's very encouraging that India is tying up these countries in the energy sector in various ways. Now, the floor is open for questions. Whoever wants to raise a question, please identify yourself and identify the panelists to whom you wish to address your question.
Thank you everyone for a very nice discussion. My name is Utsav and I'm just a recent graduate from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where I studied clean energy technologies and also sustainable energy. So I had a question regarding to Ambassador Srivastava and Mr. Harish Saran. You mentioned about the variability of renewable sources. But however, right now, I don't see any comprehensive attention being paid to the role of storage in mitigating that variability. And what kind of, in terms of, there's a problem with storage that it's a bidirectional source. And our grid, the way it is right now, it's only unidirectional. So if we are to have greater regional integration and grid connectivity with other grids in the countries surrounding us, what kind of role do you see for storage in the energy mix in terms of adding to renewables? What about the role of microgrids to provide energy access and security to those communities who can't access the grid? And basically, the opportunity for bidirectional flow in the grid in the future in the region.
Other than India, if we take the example of other countries in the region, they are not even interconnected within themselves. Like Nepal, Eastern Nepal and Western Nepal, they don't have an interconnection. Bhutan is a very small country. Their requirement is only maximum during evening time, it is 200 megawatt, not more than 200 megawatt. Bangladesh, again, their grid is very fragile. So all these countries, actually, we have come too much ahead because we started all these things 20 years back. If we talk about 1980s, we were also, I mean, India was having 5 grids. Every grid was operating on its own frequency. Now we are one nation, one grid. Similarly, steps are being taken by the other countries to strengthen their grid. Until or unless their own grid is strengthened, I mean, regional, though it is taking place, but it's going to pose a lot of challenges. And the sufferer would be India because our system is huge. It is 350 gigawatt system. The next in the region is Bangladesh. We are 350,000 megawatt, whereas Bangladesh is only 16,000. Now you see the disparity. So ultimately, the sufferer will be the Indian grid. And now we cannot, we cannot have another 29th July or 30th July. So, like this storage, microgrid, all these things we are working in India, but in other countries, I mean, they have not yet started.
Can I just add? There microgrid. Let's keep it aside because that's a valid suggestion. But the topic here is regional energy integration, so that's a separate issue. About bidirectional grid or storage issues, battery storage has not been developed. Tesla is trying, but even in the developed countries, hydro storage, it can be bidirectional, but hydro storage in India, it means land displacement. Those issues are very difficult. And bidirectional again means that Nepal has that much of energy requirement or capacity to absorb, it just doesn't exist. So it has to be, by its very nature, unidirectional. But just to illustrate your point, Europe, which is much more developed, and they have this. Germany went off nuclear after Fukushima, decided to focus on renewables, and it has created enormous problems for the European grid because the Germans have ramped up their renewable production very fast, which is creating a problem for the grids in the neighboring countries because Germans are exporting it. Now, the sudden increase in, say, wind power in North Germany has created situation where the Czech grid could burn down, and Germany uses, neighboring countries to transmit power from North Germany to South Germany. So that's another set of problems. Third, because they have discontinued or they are going to discontinue in either phasing out nuclear power, so their emissions are actually have increased. Fourth, I think there is a confusion in your question. There is a issue of variable demand and the base load. Now, the variable demand is something which you can adjust, bidirectional. Suppose Italy produces wind energy when North Germany is not producing wind energy, you can, adjust that way. But there's an issue of base load that large grids, which of the size which India or Germany will have, there is a base load demand which renewable cannot supply. Now, that base load can only come from coal or nuclear. Now, in case of Germany, there's a paradox today that they have phased out nuclear, or they are planning to phase out nuclear power, but they are actually buying up to 25,000 megawatt of power to meet their baseload requirement from countries producing uh, nuclear energy. So, that, and in any case, that luxury we don't have because they're part of a grid where there is substantial capacity elsewhere. So you can, you know, pass off your sense to somebody else because you are richer. But here there is, our neighboring countries just don't have the size.
Any other question? Yeah.
Thank you, Jay. I'm Kanchana from Claus. So my question is to Harish Saran sir. You talked about India buying electricity from Bhutan and contributing a lot to its GDP. So given that India has now become a net exporter of electricity and of power, and I do understand the point of intermittencies, doesn't the power trade look very bleak between India and Bhutan? And the thing is, doesn't the self-sufficiency of one country in power lead to regional security, energy security getting affected in a negative way? Thank you.
As far as India is concerned, you must be aware that lot of focus is being given on the renewable energy, now wind and solar. When we talk about wind and solar, they come for a certain period only, and during some months they do not generate at all. Now, eh, in today's time, our companies, our distribution companies, they are not realizing the importance of hydropower, because hydropower is going to get integrated with wind and solar very soon. You can switch on and switch off hydropower very easily. At a short notice, you can start your units. At a short notice, you can switch it off. Solar will come during daytime, say morning 6 o'clock till evening 6. After that, your load peak comes. So to compensate that demand, hydro is very essential for the distribution companies. Some of the distribution companies which are commercially, I'm using a word, which are commercially intelligent, they have already understood it and they are moving towards procuring hydropower. So Bhutan is going to, Bhutan, because Bhutan demand is very less. Even in the time to come, because of certain limitations, certain restrictions, they are not going to encourage industries of all sorts. So Bhutan hydropower, ultimately it is going to be integrated with your system. And countries like Bangladesh, they are also thinking of hydropower because their demand, that matches. There are certain areas in Bangladesh which need power during the monsoon period only, and hydropower they generate maximum during monsoon period, June to September. So now all these things are being considered by the procurers and they are taking decisions. So in the time to come, hydropower is going to play a major role.
Any other question? Yes, please.
There were some media source reports in the recent past to the effect that China and India, which consume roughly about 19% of the non-renewable energy, have formed an alliance of sorts, as it were, to try and counterpoise the OPEC, particularly in regard to the contracts and the price. Is that really a reality? And so, what is the kind of mechanism that one is looking at on a sustainable basis? The second, of course, is to bring a merchant shipping perspective to this. If we're looking at regional energy security, particularly for, and this is, I'm subject completely to correction, that if you're looking at some kind of an alliance where we can partner with shipping lines of these regions, which are the national shipping lines, to try and partner, so there are space sharing and slot sharing to try and underpin the arrangement, the overall architecture of regional energy security. Can we look at that as a viable proposition?
On the first part, India and China working together, I think it's very logical because India and China are two of the three largest energy consumers, also two of the three largest crude importers. Another commonality is that heavily reliant on imports. So while we rely to the extent of about 83%, China relies to the extent of 70% of its crude requirements in terms of imports. Also, both are quite dependent on the Middle East. For us, we source about 65% of our imports from the Middle East, crude, as far as crude is concerned. For China, it's about 48%. And the price, I mean, the way the prices have moved in the last few months, you have seen that, after being in the band of 40 to 50 for several months, now they actually touched about 80. Now they're between 70 and 80. And this causes a lot of concern to China and also to us. After all, it's also an election year, and so we have decided in the last few months to work with each other. And work is in progress. Some of our companies, our marketing companies, are working closely with Chinese marketing companies to see how we can better source our crude, how we can actually optimize sourcing of our crudes in order to reduce our reliance on one region in the world, and also to convey a signal to OPEC, because end of the day, these prices are not really market-driven prices. Prices depend on sentiments. Prices depend on some decision taken by some cartel somewhere. And now things are even more difficult because it's not just OPEC which we have to deal with. OPEC has signed this declaration of cooperation with major non-OPEC producing countries like Russia. So a decision which they might take tomorrow might have even more impact, probably adverse impact for us. So we also have to gear up as consumers. So it is still in nascent stages. We are working on that, how we can optimize our sourcing, and also the issue which Ambassador Sibal alluded to right in the beginning, the issue of Asian premium, which is something very discriminatory and works against the interest of two of the largest importers and by countries which are actually our big sources of crude. So we have to deal with that also. So in our own ways, we are also discussing both at bilateral level between India and the producers, China and the producers, and also working together between India and China to see how to deal with it. But still, it's in the nascent stages.
One last comment before I close the session, and I don't know who will answer that. Maybe you should. My impression was that at the international level, there is no longer support for hydroelectric stations. World Bank does not give any longer loans because there's been a lot of agitation about resettlement issues and this and that at the international level. But you were saying that commercially companies are now looking to have access to hydropower and this and that. So if the international community, international financial institutions, lending institutions are against financing large hydroelectric projects, then where is this additional hydroelectric power going to come from? Who will finance it? Is it that the new China set up Asian Infrastructure Structure Bank or the New Development Bank of BRICS, will they then finance hydroelectric
Yeah, a lot of projects are getting developed in Bhutan and Nepal. So Nepal, most of the finances that must be coming from Chinese financiers only.
Well, that's very limited. And with Bhutan, we are having problems because we want a different model of financing, and they are unhappy.
But still, today, almost 5,000 megawatt is under construction in Bhutan, which will come into the stream in the next 3 to 4 years.
Okay.
That is supported by the government of India only. Those projects, and some JV projects are there between NHPC, Satluj Jal Vidyut, and Bhutanese companies, government companies.
Okay, then I think we can close this session and invite you to give a big hand to the panelists. And I give the floor back to the director.
Thank you very much, sir, for sharing this panel. An excellent discussion. And it remains for me to thank the CII for having joined efforts with us to organize this very productive round of discussions. And we are grateful to the Minister, and Sanjay, please convey our thanks to the Minister. I think his keynote address set the stage for the discussions that we have had today. The discussion has been very rich, and we have talked about many sectors, each sector having its own set of challenges, opportunities, and number of suggestions have also come out, and we'll try and put it all together in the next few days and see whether some workable suggestions can come out. But I just want to make 3-4 broad points. The main purpose of this conference was to assess the current status of India's connectivity with its neighbors. That's essentially in the regional context. And I think what came out was on the whole, an encouraging picture, but also with the rider that a lot more needs to be done. And why do I say encouraging? Because I've been part of many such discussions in the last 10-15 years. And I think the nature of discussions have gradually changed. We have, of course, every time have challenges and opportunities. It doesn't matter whether we were talking in the 19th century or now. So there will always be challenges, there will always be opportunities. But I think said just about 10 years ago, even to talk about transit was blasphemy in the context of India-Bangladesh relations. And now we are talking about giving them 500 megawatts, we're talking about Palatana, we're talking about transit through them, we're talking inland waterways, etc. And certainly the atmosphere or the situation environment has also changed quite dramatically with Nepal and Bhutan as well. And the power trading that has started happening. This is a development of the last few years. This was not the case earlier. So I think a lot of progress has been made in regional connectivity, and which only to make the point that this is still in nascent stages. I think the problems which Shebonti outlined towards the end, they're all real problems, and they still exist. But today, I think the atmosphere is much better to resolve these issues. Where I was a little bit disappointed was on the shipping side, not because Mr. Shetty is sitting here, but overall, I think I was really saddened to hear that our share in shipping, which is a strategic industry, which we understood at one point of time, that's why we had a much higher share, and today it has plummeted just at the time when we want to emerge as a major power. Now, shipping is a strategic sector, and I don't have to go into the arguments, etc., because they've all been done. So I still don't understand why is it that we have not been able to change that mindset, because a lot of these challenges that we talked about today are all essentially in the policy sector. Of course, there will be technology issues, there will be taxation issues, financial issues, etc. But that is the second stage. The first is the policy. If the policy is right, and the policy will be right only if your thinking, long-term thinking is right, and which can come only if once we realize that what is it that, why are we doing all this? Why do we want this regional cooperation? What is in it for us in India? Why is it? Because we want to today, India is rising, India, prosperity is dependent on connectivity. And our status in the world, in the region and in the world depends upon these very issues that we talked about. I think connectivity is an extremely important thing. And this probably should go down right up to National Security Council or some other place like that, where we should really discuss. But I think a whole set of issues came out, which is essentially in terms of consolidation. As we can see, a lot of things are happening in different sectors. In the same sector itself, there is no consolidation. I mean, the minister talked about, today we discussed with him, there are 5 major ministries which deal with some aspect of energy or the other. I think they should all come together, along with ministries which deal with infrastructure, along with ministries which deal with strategy, etc., like the MEA and so on. So I think time has come to look at these issues in a holistic and coordinated fashion, and that's not just a cliche. It is the need of the hour. And we must have some kind of integrated, maybe energy council or some such thing, where all these big decisions are taken. Another need is to connect one sector with the other. And Mr. Shetty talked about the shipping part when he was hearing the energy. I think because if we do that, our shipping will come out of the doldrums. So there are many issues which we need to look at in an integrated fashion, and I think that is probably one big suggestion that will come out from these discussions. Political will and security, these will remain the fundamental issues that we will have to deal with. Because these are sovereign countries and elections happen, people change, and opposition parties, when they come to the as become ruling parties, they have different views and so on. We all know that. But the way to handle this is really to have much closer level of dialogues. Now, why is it, for instance, we don't have a forum, say in BBIN or BIMSTEC, a forum of energy ministers? We always have, okay, some kind of a summit, maybe sometimes foreign ministers meet, but we don't have forum which of that ministerial level, say, dealing with the energy issues. Now, if we can develop more such interactions and more such interactions in an institutionalized way among our regional countries, many of these problems might be sorted out. So we have to do a lot of work in terms of how to implement this. But first, for that, we have to set up some institutional forums as well. Then we have this, the we are today, one big mindset change that we require is to think ourselves as a maritime power. A lot of these issues will go away if we really thought about the marine power. You have talked about the Chabahar as a shipping hub, and where which can take some traffic to Africa. And this was we discussed in the context of how to set up an India-Africa economic corridor. Now, I do not know whether the idea is workable, not workable. Maybe this can be done, if not in Chabahar, maybe it can be done in Oman. I mean, that is much easier perhaps. But anyhow, these ideas have been talked about, but not fully fleshed out. So I think this is one suggestion, that when we look at the regional countries, we must have proper regional forum. It's not enough to simply have only at the summit level, but at other working level also we should have these meetings. India's strength, as was pointed out in the context of shipping, but also it came out in the context of energy, is we started working, as say, 20 years ago on some of these issues. So technology was put in place, some institutions were put in place, etc. Now, the other countries, as you said, they don't have anything. So capacity building could be a very big aspect of our regional connectivity, because most countries want to have some help in capacity building. One issue which we did not discuss and was very briefly touched in, I think, Sri Radha's presentation. All this also has a infrastructure construction, building, etc., has a very strong environmental impact. And to that, I will also add the views of the local populations. Many of these projects can get held up if there is a local opposition, maybe genuine, maybe motivated, and this can happen in Myanmar. It has happened. I think Kaladan, some part of the project, I think, has been affected because of some local oppositions, etc. So this importance of consultations and making projects in consultation with others, some kind of a mechanism. Of course, the sovereignty issues and all that is there, but I think we have to learn from the experience of Europe and some other places. How is it that they are able to handle these issues? But environment is also a very big issue, as was mentioned in the context of roads in the morning. You have these hills which are all made of sill, and when they get saturated with water, the hills come down and they get saturated because the deforestation, etc., has taken place. Now, moment we bring environment into this equation, things become far more complicated. In fact, environment versus development becomes almost like a binary. I think, and a lot of our projects, particularly of the strategic kind, building of these strategic roads, etc., have been held up simply because there are not environmental clearances or there's not enough understanding. So environment will have to be brought in. Well, these are some of the stray thoughts that I thought I will just share, but we'll try and build a kind of a report out of this and share it with you. Thank you very much, sir, and thank you everyone. And I know the people who stay till the last, they are like the Pandavas. They have been here throughout the day, and a hand to those people who have stayed back. Thank you very much.